Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your Twitter feed or on the evening news or in a letter, which we'll be discussing later on in the show, has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Whitney Terrell, the author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
And I'm Vivi Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the forthcoming novel Brotherless Night.
You know what we're going to do today?
We're going to talk about how every issue in your Twitter feed or on the evening news has already been tackled.
No, not this time.
Are we changing our well-loved shtick?
God forbid that we change our shtick. Okay, we're not going to be reading Twitter. That's the deal. We're not even going to be watching something as old-fashioned as the evening news. It is kind of, the evening news in our tagline is kind of old-fashioned in and of itself. My kids have never seen the evening news. You know what we're going to do instead? We're going to talk about how every issue in your small town gazette, or the forgotten box of letters in your bedroom, or on that sketch pad where a one-time lover once drew pictures of you.
Wait a second. Nobody writes letters anymore. Not to mention drawing pictures. How many people have drawn pictures of you?
There have been more people than you would think have drawn pictures of me, because there have been a lot of artists in my family. My grandfather used to draw pictures and make little busts of all of his grandkids. But nobody since he died that I know of.
Oh, wait, I'm realizing I've actually seen one of these paintings.
Yeah, in my house.
So we are talking history here.
Yes, we're going to talk about fiction set in the past and the politics of the past, both personal and universal. And we're doing that because we're extremely honored to have Andrea Barrett on the show. And that's what she does, make the past way, way more immediate than your Twitter feed.
Andrea Barrett received the National Book Award for her fifth book, Ship Fever, a collection of stories featuring scientists, doctors, and naturalists. In 2001, she received a MacArthur Fellowship and was also a fellow at the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library. Servants of the Map was a finalist for the 2003 Pulitzer Prize in Fiction. In addition to many other prizes and awards, she's also been a finalist for the Story Prize and received the Ray Award for the short story. Today, we're going to talk to her about her new collection of stories, Natural History. Andrea, welcome to the show.
Thanks. I'm really glad to be here.
We're very excited for you to be here. Henrietta Atkins is the central sort of connecting character in the stories in this book, I think it's fair to say, and she appears as a character in your book, Archangel, as well. Could you just introduce our listeners to this character and her history in your work? You know, who is she? What does she care about? Who are her important friends in this book? And what caused you to decide to construct this book around her, if it was a decision at all?
She arose when I was writing Archangel. And when I first conceived of her, she was a very young girl, just out of high school, ready to start her training as a teacher. And I knew almost nothing about her, as often happens with people when they invent characters. I made her as a character to go to that particular summer school, which was a real place and was very unusual and was really close to where I lived. I'd always been fascinated by it. But you know how writing fiction goes. You make a person for convenience, and the next thing you know, she's like a living, breathing person with a life and relatives and wants and needs and loves and desires. And by the end of that story, I knew a lot about Henrietta. She appears in a story called The Island, and it's a long story, but I still wasn't done with her when I finished that. So later on, I just wrote Wonders of the Shore, which is the first story in the new collection, and picks her up some years later, still studying marine biology. And then I thought I was done with her, but it turned out I wasn't. So more stories ensued. This happens to me literally all the time. I never write a story that it doesn't spill over into another story, sometimes with the same character, or sometimes with what was a minor character in the first story. So now there's a lot of Henrietta.
It seems pretty clear that you weren't like, I'm going to write a Henrietta book, but was there a moment when you realized, oh, I'm going to have a book that's going to maybe revolve around her?
I think in my whole life, this is my 10th book. I don't think I've ever started a book thinking this is the kind of book I'm going to write, or this is where I'm going, which is appalling, I guess. But no, I didn't know I was going to write it.
It seems to be working out so far. I don't know why it would be bad.
It's so weird. You'd think I would get where I'm going after all these years, but it's always a surprise. After I wrote Open House, that felt like the end of the book. she appears as a very elderly woman in another story, an archangel. And so I knew that was the very end of her life. And I thought open house was near the end of her life. And then I looked at what I had and I thought, oh, maybe I do have a book. But I knew I needed one more story. And that's when I wrote Henrietta and Her Moths. I wanted something that would talk about her as a woman more in the kind of middle years of her life, when she's just as covered with responsibilities as we all are in the middle years of our lives, trying to juggle family and work, and the sense that life is closing down and opening up at the same time. And then I knew I had a book after that.
Can you talk a little bit about some of her important friends in the book? There are some very memorable characters who also recur.
Yeah. The closest person to her is her friend Daphne Bannister, who she meets as a young woman on Penakees Island. They're both about 20 when they meet, which is that time in our lives when we often make our most passionate and long-lasting friendships. And they do too, even though they don't live in the same town, they are able to keep up a thread of connection through their work. They're constantly sending bits of their scientific manuscripts back and forth to each other. And they try to read books in common and talk about what they're reading. And in some ways, that's the most autobiographical strand of the book. I have a dear friend that I share all my writing with and that I've known for many, many years. And I think I was trying to mirror some of that feeling in the relationship of Henrietta and Daphne.
I love that story and that relationship. The friendship is so complex because it has, I mean, I think so often you don't see that much writing about women in science anyway, certainly not in the era that you sort of have carved out as your terrain and Henrietta's terrain, and the camaraderie between them. And then also the really complex jealousy at some points is just fascinating, and I think is one of the things that makes the story feel so it felt so contemporary, actually, in that way.
Thanks. I mean, I'm glad that resonates in that way. I was really lucky as a young woman. My husband worked as a scientist for many years and ran a big lab. And when he was in graduate school and doing his postdoc, I was doing secretarial work and worse work, just all sorts of things just to pay the bills. So I got to hang around both young scientists in training, and their much older mentors, and to be essentially invisible because everyone just knew me as Barry's wife. I was just the person who was, typing tax forms down the road at the next town over. So I could really watch them. And it happened that the field he was an X-ray crystallographer, is a very unusual field in 20th century scientists, and that women were involved in it right away. You probably know the name Rosalind Franklin from DNA. Yeah. So she was trained by several other women, and there's this chain of women crystallographers and women in related fields that ran all the way through 20th century science. So I got to watch those women struggle, because still most of the people were men. Most of them were, one or two among a set of women in a very large institution. They all went out of their way to train other women. They had really complicated lives. They all had families. So I think that's where I started to pay attention to all that and what that might feel like, and what those struggles might feel like.
So one of the things that draws me to Henrietta in these stories is that she's so self-possessed, and most of the time she's sure of what she wants. And but she's also in a situation where, she's unmarried, and that's one of the things that makes her life difficult, that she's an unmarried woman interested in science in the late 1800s, as we mentioned. And I keep noticing the way that in the stories, people keep wanting to marry her off, or asking, why are you yourself? And the way that people are just confused by her refusal to fit into an accepted gender role or category. Or even an unaccepted role or category. There are ways that the story gestures at questions that we might ask about Henrietta now more openly. And I'm curious about how much that her status as a single woman played into your interest in conception of her.
I love that phrase you had, why are you yourself? You know, isn't that the question for all of us, no matter what time we're in? If we're doing anything even slightly off the beaten path, people are looking at us and essentially saying, why are you you? Why are you doing that? And yeah, I felt I couldn't express that fully in her unless she were single. There were a not small number of American women naturalists from the 1820s through the 1920s, and I've gotten to know their work pretty well over the years. Some were single, a lot were married, and a lot were married to men who worked in the same field. And so they were able to do their first work as their husband's partners. You'll often see their names paired on books. And I'm very interested in that relationship, but I wanted to see what would happen if you stripped that prop away and you just sent a woman out into the world, trying to make her own way without the husband as a kind of cover for her, if you will. It's almost like all those women had beards. They had someone to shield them from what they were actually doing and being.
I want to skip ahead just a little bit to sort of in the middle of the book. There's a story called The Accident, and one of Henrietta's nieces, Carolyn, is disfigured by an accident. Her hair is gone. She has stitches. She's removed from the realm of accepted feminine beauty, which her sister Alice inhabits, and it seems no surprise that it's Henrietta who gives her the one gift she likes, Amundsen's account of his expedition to the South Pole. Could you talk about that story and the relationship between these two women?
Sure. Carolyn's one of a whole host of sisters. I don't think she's particularly good looking, nor is Henrietta. They're all sort of normal looking women, except for young Alice, who's so beautiful. But it's one thing to be a normal looking woman who just passes imperceptibly down the street. It's another to be really facially disfigured. And I think Henrietta is the only person in her family who can understand what it means to of necessity be living by your wits and your skills and your desires and not by your look. She's probably not going to marry. She's not going to be pursued for the way she looks or the way she might grace a husband's household. And so that does form a very strong bond between them. And I think her gesture of bringing Amundsen's book to her is a way of pushing her out into the larger world and away from the domestic, because she's not going to have a chance really to make that home that some of her friends are. I was also just really interested in the early days of flying, and Carolyn gets injured in this plane that still, when I look at these planes, I can hardly believe them. It's like you took two brooms and crossed them with a parrot's cage and put a propeller on it. And then a person sits in the middle of it and goes zoom, 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 and it flies. It's crazy that people could do this. And I love the idea, and there were women who did that then, of her zipping around the lake in this little contraption.
So we've touched on the connections across some of your work. There's a remarkable chart at the end of this collection, which traces the names of characters and families that you've written about over time, and in many books like Ship Fever and Servants of the Map. And it made me just think about this collection's relationship to time, because the chart itself seems like almost a representation of the essential simultaneity of time. And I'm curious about what made you decide it was time to include that chart in a book.
You should see the chart on my wall if you think this one looks bad.
Is it right next to you?
No, it's in another room. I'm sorry.
Okay.
And it's also in pencil. You'd never be able to see it. But yeah, I've been keeping that since the voyage of the Narwhal. I actually published an earlier version of it in The Air We Breathe. And then as I added a whole new wings to it, I decided we needed it again. I think it's going to be baffling for people who just read this book, because only like a teaspoonful of the characters on the chart are in the book. But for anyone who's somehow read through all 6 books, you can finally see how all the wings of the family fit together. I don't think this is actually important to anybody but me, but it's really important.
It's important to me. I love that kind of stuff. It's
you.
like Yoknapatawpha County. I love this sort of sense of characters that move in between and over books and over time.
Well, I do too. And I like your idea that it creates a kind of simultaneity of time, because for me, all those times and all those characters are simultaneous across the book. I mean, they're all alive in my head, even though they inhabit several continents and 3 different centuries and many, many wings of the family. Either they're all dead or they're all alive. I don't know what's the right way to put that. I guess they're all invented, but I don't think of them as linearly. I think of them, it's a kind of a big web, or even more a sort of, what would the word be for a globe that was also made up of webs? Like a little wire globe that was all threaded through, whatever that
It's
is.
a little bit like the way a baseball is constructed by wrapping yarn around itself over and over again. But I think you're not thinking about that in that kind of density. But yeah.
Yeah, if you could open that up so there was air between all those quarters where
Yeah.
the threads cross, that's what it looks like in my head.
So speaking of time, there are moments in several of these stories, and I do encourage readers to look at the chart. And actually, it helps, I think, particularly when we're talking about when you're thinking about the last story, which is hard for us to talk about without giving away really cool things. So we're not gonna do that. But speaking of time, there are several moments in several of these stories when you skip suddenly forward in time, often right in the middle of what seems like a still developing scene. For instance, on page 23 in the first story, Wonders of the Shore, Henrietta is involved in a very complex scene with, where a lot of complicated things are happening, many of them connected to a woman named Celia Thaxter. And then suddenly you begin the next section by writing, Celia Thaxter died in 1894, 9 years after the scene that we were just reading, right? This happens quite frequently,
Guilty as charged.
in the work. And I wonder if you could just I can talk about how these jumps made me feel as a reader, and I have theories about them, but I'm curious, as the writer, what causes you to make the jump right in that point? And what are you aiming for me to feel by skipping time like that?
Well, I'm super interested in knowing what you feel, but I'll tell you what I hope for primarily is that you're not bored. One of the things I dislike in historical fiction is when people just go on and 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 on. Kind of the layers of detail of the time. I want it, in a sense, not to feel like history. I want you to be alive in it and present in it, and for someone to come by and just like turn your chin forcibly to make you look in another direction suddenly and think, oh, what's over there, and what happened later, what happened before, to keep you thinking about all the implications of a single scene rather than getting rooted in the one scene linearly. Can you say what happens to you? Will you say what happens to you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, for me, what it made me think about reading this book, I thought a lot about time in my own life. I'm about to turn 55. And I thought, oh, you need to be paying much better attention. You can always say this to yourself, but it reminded me to pay attention to the immediate moment, because there are times in my life when you can say now, 9 years later, this happened. Right. And it made me recognize that the frailty of all of us living in time, how little time we get. And it created an awareness of that immediacy and pressure of how little time any of these characters get and how little time I have, that made the events in the story seem more important.
Well, you just said that so way better than I could articulate it. But that, in a perfect world, that's what I hope for. It's what I hope for in my life. And also what I hope for my readers is, anything that wakes us up to our own lives and the lives of the people around us, that causes us not to drift aimlessly through the days and through our lives, but to recognize each moment and each interaction as potentially something that you're going to say 9 years later, she looked back on that and thought that was the moment when she knew she was going to leave her husband, or that was the moment when she knew something, because we all have those later, but in our lives, we can't go back and get a do-over. In fiction, we can turn the pages back and look at that moment again and think, oh yeah, that's what was important there.
I'm going to be studying with my son for the ACT tonight, and I realize I'm going to look back and be like, this was some of the last times that he lived in my house, and
oh my God,
he's about to go. And,
oh
so I
my
think
God.
about that while I was thinking about, your story.
No, that's
in
huge.
this same, yeah, I know.
Yeah.
In the same vein, I thought a lot about the importance of letters in this book, physical handwritten letters. I'm a person whose life has bridged letters, so I wrote a lot of letters and now don't write any letters at different, in the collection's second story, Henrietta is nannying in essence for a family in her town, and she ends up transcribing letters between her employer, Mr. Deverell, and his brothers who are fighting in the Civil War. I wondered if you could read to us from that story, maybe just sort of set up what's happening in the story right before the part we're asking you to read.
Sure. She's working for a potter and his wife who have a toddler, and the wife is pregnant, and the oftentimes the husband can't pick up a letter or do something because his hands are covered with clay and his wife is overwhelmed. So sometimes Henrietta takes charge of the letters in her fussy little way. She smooths them out and dates them and puts them in a box. And because she's nosy, she reads them. And on occasion, she's employed to write back because her handwriting is neat. So she gets to learn more than she might otherwise have learned about. These are battles that are taking place in 1863. And in particular, the sequence of letters is from a real battle, Chancellorsville, which a lot of people will know, but which isn't named in the book. It was right before Gettysburg. You want me to just read from the beginning of the letter?
Well, there's a point at which late in the story, and this is a very complicated story, so we're not going to be able to lay out the entire plot. We encourage, the complication is its beauty, and it's really about sort of authorship and how history is remembered. But there was a really kind of amazing letter late in the book that tells the story of what really happened to one of the brothers. I wondered if you could just read to us from that.
Sure. See if I can find it. Is this the one you mentioned on page 58?
Yeah, it's
or is
58.
Yeah. Okay. This starts out many years after the war, as the various regiments are starting to write their own regimental histories. And this comes from a banker in Troy who's trying to put together his history. And he writes in 1887, "Dear Mr. Deverell, please forgive me for intruding on you. I've taken on the duty of writing a history of my regiment, and I'm seeking news of your brother, whom I knew as Vic. Our regiment was raised in Washington County in August of 1862, drilled and trained at Arlington Heights before heading to Harper's Ferry for guard duty, and then going into winter quarters, first near Fairfax, and then after the Mud March, into the cabins abandoned at Stafford. During the battles that May, our paths may have crossed. On the evening of May 2nd, after heavy fighting was noticed to our right, portions of our corps were rushed to the valley and across the open field. There we crossed great numbers of men from your corps and forced retreat after you were flanked. The men were moving with utmost haste, jackets and knapsacks and caps flying from their hands, even their guns in some cases, regiments all jumbled together and pouring through our line as we braced to fight. We lost 10 men there, nothing compared to what you saw, but hard enough. You and your brother might already have been separated from each other and the rest of the regiment by then. After the 12th, we were encamped on the other side of the river, near the courthouse, through the rest of May and June. Half a dozen of us were sent on detached duty to the Balloon Corps, where we served as ground crew, repaired the netting, and so forth. Some Massachusetts men were with us, and also a few from your regiment, including Vic. He proved his worth quickly, helping to rig a temporary gas generator after a storm that destroyed 4 barrels of iron trimmings and several carboys of acid and damaged the field generator. When another heavy storm came up during a later ascent and caused a weakened seam to explode, he helped lower balloon and aeronaut to the ground. The director appreciated his skill and asked to retain him for another few weeks when your regiment requested the return of its men. Some confusion resulted from this, and your colonel apparently reported him as a deserter when he didn't return with the others. I was back with my own regiment by the time the work of the balloonists was terminated and assumed he'd returned to you then, but later heard he could not be found before the march had ended at Gettysburg, nor after. I have no record of his whereabouts since. Because we in our regiment found our work with the aeronauts so interesting, and because Vic played a role before the Balloon Corps was disbanded, we would like to include in our regimental history some mention of his life after that time. We all wondered if the nightmares stopped or if his ability to eat returned. All he would ever tell me about his injuries was that he was knocked unconscious by a bullet grazing his head and was still there on the morning of May 4th, when the Johnnies came through to bury those who'd been lying there wounded since the day before, and then trapped when the shells lit the woods on fire. The heat from the fire had waked him, and he was able to crawl away, but said most were not so lucky, and that he saw the Rebs rolling the roasted bodies, trying to determine for bits of uniform which army they'd fought with. I still remember him crying when he told me about the scraped dirt around some of the bodies, where the men who'd been alive when the fire started tried to push the leaves and twigs away from themselves. So maybe that's what happened to Vic, or maybe it's not.
Thank you so much. The way that stories are altered over time and the effect that time has on memory seem to be one of the issues that you're wrestling with in all of these stories, not just this one. And over, people, and alongside the people in the stories, your readers discover surprising facts about people that they love, or facts that seem like facts but weren't. And one crucial way that this happens is through writing. There are these revelations that arrive quietly. And this is probably a little over the top, but it feels like there's a struggle between time, which erases our stories, which erases so many stories, and writing, which struggles to preserve our stories. In your fiction about Henrietta, do you feel like that's a fair thing to say?
I do think that's a fair thing to say. I feel that all the time, especially now when nobody's writing down anything anymore. All we have left after we go, and then after the people who knew us go, that's it. If nothing's written down, that the time the last person who knew you dies is the time the last story about you dies, if somebody didn't write something down. So I feel an almost frantic sense to get things down with my pen before everything disappears. And I think Henrietta feels like that too. And I think some of the other characters do. I think Rose in the last story feels that very strongly.
There's also, in that particular passage, one of the things about that story is that as Henrietta and then Bernard, who is the Mr. Deverell's son, are trying to find the letters again that were written by Izzy and Vic, and they find out the person who's supposed to be keeping track of them, and it turns out that changes have been made to the story that sound very familiar to me as an author. Well, I've decided to put these two characters together. They'll work better that way. And I felt like there's an author understanding how history is written, that it's not always that there's a balance between not being boring, as you were mentioning before, and like trying to be accurate. I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I love history. I read a lot of history. People who work with history in their fiction lie at any place along the continuum between I will change whatever I feel like because it's my prerogative, and I will change nothing because I want to be true to what I know to be the facts. And I'm way towards the second part of that. I won't change a date that I know to have been recorded when something happened. I won't put a person in a city where I know that she wasn't for some reason on that day, but I will do the smaller deceits, which is to combine two people into one, especially if there's no other record of them besides the one I'm making. As it happens, Izzy and Vic are both fictional characters. So when I have a third character, combine the lives of those two into one, I feel like, first of all, I'm not distorting history, I hope. But second of all,
you're commenting on the way that sometimes happens,
yeah,
I think,
exactly.
in real
I'm
life.
trying to make apparent for the reader to make the reader question a little how history does get made, because often our tendency as a naive reader of history is to think, well, that's what happened. But history is written too, just like fiction. And every minute we're making decisions about what to leave out, what to put in, what to emphasize, when to combine two scenes into one for economy and grace. It's far from accurate. It's as written as anything else. And it's, I think, useful to think about that, especially now when, we have that amazing phrase, false facts, floating around the atmosphere. True facts, false facts. Oof.
Oh my God. I'm trying to imagine how people even consider facts in 10 years from now.
I know. Are there going to be any?
Can't answer that.
Okay. I'll let you off the hook. I can't answer it either.
We often end our interviews by asking for a little bit of a forecast. And in this case, we're curious what some future Andrea Barrett is going to do when she sets off to write about us and discovers that we no longer write letters, and that all of our correspondence, if we have any, has been stored on computers whose software no longer works, or on defunct social media sites, or has turned into like a different kind of detritus.
This actually terrifies me, because I can't imagine what the answer to that is. Even right now, writers have papers, or we used to have papers, and we used to put them in universities, and we do sometimes what we have on paper. But what about all the stuff that already isn't on paper? What about all our email correspondence? What about everything that's just in text messages? Where is that all going to go? And how is anyone going to make our lives over and make our lives up without that? I guess the answer is you keep updating the software or the hardware or something, but I can't do any of that. So I don't know how that happens. I sometimes feel like we're just going to dissolve, that our lives are just going to melt and be erased somehow. It gives me the willies.
Do you think that the way that we write to each other is different because when I think about, because as a little kid, I would send elaborate postcards to sleepaway camp to my friends, and I would write them as small as possible to cram in as much as possible with the sense that I was making a document that might be kept.
Yeah.
And now when I write an email, there's like a different sense of its archival potential, right? I mean, do you think that we talk and write to each other differently?
Oh, that's so interesting. If I understand you correctly, do you mean differently in the sense that you're afraid that it's going to be preserved, so you're more careful?
Or maybe that there's a kind of freedom to thinking, when I text Whitney some silly thing or a series of links or a picture that someone, I don't know, we often talk about how the phrase of the online world might be like keeping receipts, right? That this sort of correspondence makes it easier to hold people accountable, but maybe that's just in the short term, and maybe in the long term it's actually a lot harder.
I think that's really interesting. I know how to text, but I really only do with a couple friends. I don't do any business stuff on it, and I don't use social media. So I actually never heard that phrase, keeping receipts, before. But, of course, I read about people who've been hung in court by all the text messages that someone dug up. So I know it happens. And that's terrifying too. But, if you were in a battle in the Civil War and you were writing back to your mother, always we censored ourselves some, right? Especially in the days when people read letters out loud to each other. There's all those examples in the 18th and 19th centuries of people who wrote one letter to be read by a family group and then would enclose in it a second letter, just for Chuck. And they put like the gossip in there, or, the whatever was sexy and interesting that they didn't want mom to read or the kids to read. So we've had those layers of openness and closeness, and those layers of hiddenness with other written communication. Does that exist with online communication? You would know that better than I would.
I'm just thinking
you could have a Facebook group where you only talk to certain people on Facebook, but not posting to the whole world. But then people find out about those anyway, and those become public too.
So so are you saying there's no secret text or secret Facebook thing that people can be private in?
Texts are encrypted. And so if you're sending a text on an iPhone to an iPhone, mostly that's just between you and the other person, unless the other person chooses to screenshot them and put them on the internet for everyone else to see.
Right.
Well,
and there are other texting platforms, especially as people have become more paranoid about surveillance.
Yeah.
People use platforms like Signal, and have started to be more careful about things like Messenger, or because of the sense that someone might be kind of watching over your shoulder. At the same time, I can't think of to imagine a novel that involves like a long Facebook Messenger chain. Exactly, but actually a lot of plot can happen on a Facebook Messenger chain. I wouldn't want to read it in that format.
Yeah,
it seems denuded of elegance in some way. That maybe I'm biased.
No, I don't know. I think it's really interesting. I think there's always this war in us between our urge to blurt out and confess and our urge to hide and be private. And if you read writers' letters from hundreds of years ago, or you read anybody's letters, books of letters are great reading. You can almost feel the writer forgetting that someone's going to read this, or forgetting that more than one person at the other end might read it, or that someone might save it. Because, you start writing on the page and you just start saying stuff. And then you put it in the post and you forget what you said. And so maybe it's not so different in some ways. Sometimes I can't believe what people said in letters 100 years ago or 300 years ago. It really intrigues me.
It's amazing to think about. I mean, right, Whitney is the person who thought of that question about letters, which I loved. And I think
Yeah.
of letters as this vehicle of intimacy, and then those jumps in time as this gesture to scope. And I feel like there's like one of the things that's so important and alive about your fiction is that the way that it unites intimacy and scope. And I was thinking about like one of the earliest epistolary novels I read as a kid, and I don't know if either of you read this, was Daddy Longlegs.
Oh yeah, I
Um,
read that.
yeah, and it has in it like the same contemporary feel
Mhm.
of this person who's not censoring herself because she doesn't know who she's writing to.
Right.
And for those of our listeners who aren't familiar with this novel, it's about a young woman who grows up at an orphanage and then is sent by a mysterious benefactor to college. And college is a very weird time anyway. And she is asked as the only thing to repay her benefactor to write these letters. And the letters that form this novel have like stick figure drawings in them. And it just sort of has this it has this real intimacy, and you feel a little bit like you're spying on something, or like
Yeah.
Harriet the Spy, or
Yeah.
um there's this, yeah, this question of who will read this later. Well, I wasn't thinking about that when I wrote it, which is so fun.
I love that too. And I love that sense that letters bring a real intimacy to a fictional text that you really can't get any other way. When I was writing the regimental history and also some other stuff, I was reading a lot of letters that soldiers wrote during the Civil War. And not so much the sort of big Ken Burnsy ones, but there's a lot of either self-published or published by very tiny texts, Civil War accounts and Civil War letters. Just really patient local historians in small towns have gathered together letters from like two guys who lived in that town. And maybe 250 copies are published. But when you find those, there's a power to them and an unself-consciousness that's very amazing. And for me, brings some of the costs of war home in ways that almost nothing else does.
Well, Andrea, we so appreciate you joining us for this conversation. And listeners, don't miss Natural History, which is out right now. And if you haven't already read it, and we know many of you have, please check out the rest of Andrea's work.
Thank you very much for the wonderful questions. You really made me think about a lot of things. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for joining us.